The prairie had always been her comfort. Wide skies, golden grass swaying in the wind, and the little cabin she and her late husband had built with their own hands. For years it had been enough. Small harvests, a few cattle, and the love they shared under the endless horizon. But since his passing, the land had grown harsher, and the weight of running the ranch alone pressed heavier each day. She did what she could, patching fences, hauling water, and praying that the debt her husband left behind wouldn't catch up with her. But one morning, it did. The banker arrived in a polished buggy, his suit stiff as his smile. He didn't bother with kindness. With papers in hand and two deputies standing at his side, he announced the widow's debt had come due, and long past due at that. She tried to reason, tried to explain she only needed a little more time. Her voice cracked, her hands trembled, but the banker's eyes held no mercy. Before she could blink, he ordered men to seize her livestock, her furniture, even the rocking chair her husband had carved. The neighbors gathered, some whispering in pity, others smirking at her downfall. She felt each look like a lash across her back. When the wagon rolled away with everything she owned, she stood barefoot in the dust, clutching a single small bag of belongings, her husband's Bible, a faded shawl, and a few scraps of bread. The banker tipped his hat, a cruel smirk curling his lips, and rode off as if she were nothing more than dirt beneath his wheels. Alone, stripped of her home and dignity, the widow stood trembling in the street. The prairie that once promised freedom now seemed endless and merciless. She was no longer a rancher's wife, no longer a landowner, only a woman cast aside, with nowhere left to go. The widow walked through town with her small bag pressed to her chest, every step heavier than the last. The same streets she once strolled with her husband now felt foreign, hostile. Shopkeepers turned their eyes away when she paused near their doors, pretending to sweep or stock shelves rather than acknowledge her. At the boarding house, the landlady shook her head, muttering that without coin she had no room to spare. Even old friends who once shared coffee on cool mornings found excuses to slip back inside and close their shutters. It was as if the moment the banker stripped her land from her, the town stripped her humanity too. She had become invisible, worse, a burden none wanted to carry. The banker, meanwhile, didn't let the humiliation end with the taking of her home. He passed her in the street later that afternoon, tipping his hat with mock politeness. "A shame," he said loudly enough for others to hear. "A woman ought to keep her affairs in order. Some folk simply aren't meant to own land." Laughter rippled from a group of men lounging outside the saloon, the sound cutting through her like a knife. Her mind drifted to her husband's voice, the way he used to speak of their land as a legacy. "This soil will feed us, and someday, our children." She remembered the pride in his eyes, the sweat on his brow after long days building their dream. Now all of it was gone, taken by ink on a paper, and a man with no heart. The widow's legs carried her beyond the edge of town as the sun dipped low, the air cooling against her tear-streaked cheeks. Dust clung to her hem, her worn shoes giving way to stones that bit into her feet. The prairie stretched endlessly before her, wide and empty, offering no comfort. Her body trembled with exhaustion and hunger, the weight of despair pressing harder than any yoke. At last, on the outskirts of town, she sank to her knees beside a scraggly cottonwood tree. Her bag slipped from her hands, spilling its meager contents into the dirt. With her face buried in her palms, she let the sobs come, raw and unrestrained. For the first time since her husband's death, she allowed herself to admit the truth. She was utterly alone, and she no longer knew how to keep going. The prairie dusk was settling when a shadow broke the horizon, a lone rider moving with unhurried purpose. The widow, curled near the cottonwood tree, lifted her head at the sound of hooves. Her first instinct was fear. She was used to sneers and harsh words now. But as the horse drew nearer, she saw a man sitting tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered beneath a striped shirt and dark vest, his wide-brimmed black hat casting his face in shadow. He dismounted with quiet ease, boots pressing into the dirt beside her. He didn't crowd her, didn't speak right away. Instead, he pulled a canteen from his saddlebag and held it out. "Water," he said simply, his voice deep and steady. Her cracked lips parted, hesitating. No one in town had lifted a hand to help her. Suspicion flickered, but thirst won. She drank, the cool water sliding down like mercy itself. When she lowered the canteen, she found his eyes, steady, unreadable, but not unkind. The cowboy crouched, pulling a small parcel of food from his saddlebag. A heel of bread, some dried meat. "Eat," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to offer. Her hands trembled as she accepted. "You don't have to," she whispered, ashamed of her weakness. "Maybe not," he replied, his gaze turning briefly to the distant town, "but I've seen enough cruelty to know when a person's had their fill." Something in his tone struck her, a weight behind the words, as if he knew loss too, though he didn't speak of it. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was solid, like ground she could finally stand on. He extended his hand, rough and calloused. "Come on, you can't stay out here tonight. My place is a ride from here." Safe, warm, her breath caught. Kindness was foreign now, and she hardly knew how to receive it. Yet there was no judgment in his eyes, no pity either, only a quiet strength that steadied her own shaking. Slowly, she placed her hand in his, allowing him to help her to her feet. As he led her to his horse, she felt the stirrings of something she thought she'd lost forever, the fragile hope that not everyone in this world had turned against her. Word traveled quickly in town. The widow had not vanished into the dust after all. She was seen riding beside the quiet cowboy, her face pale but no longer hollow with despair. Whispers spread, and before long the banker himself stopped the cowboy in the street. "You've taken in a beggar," the banker sneered, his polished boots planted wide, his voice loud enough for bystanders to hear. "Men like you ought to know better than to waste good coin and good land on someone who couldn't even keep what she was given." The cowboy didn't flinch. He stood with arms loose at his sides, his hat shadowing his steady gaze. The banker smirked, waiting for anger, for a retort. But the cowboy's silence was heavier than any shout, a quiet strength that made even the loiterers uneasy. At last, the cowboy said, calm and firm, "What I do with my land, and my time, is no concern of yours." Then he turned his back, guiding the widow away, leaving the banker fuming in the dust. Life on his ranch was simple but steady. The widow, though timid at first, soon found her hands eager for work. She helped in the kitchen, stirring stew over the fire, her laughter bubbling when the cowboy's loyal dog stole a scrap of bread from the table. She gathered eggs in the morning light, the sun warming her shoulders, and brushed down the horses in the quiet of the barn. Each small task gave her a piece of herself back. Evenings were softer. They shared meals at the rough-hewn table, the cowboy listening more than speaking, yet every glance held respect. Sometimes, as the prairie cooled and the sky filled with stars, they walked the ridge together. She would speak of her husband's dream, and he, after long pauses, would share pieces of his own past, the brother he'd lost, the battles he no longer fought. Under that vast starlit sky, they found something unspoken but real, a bond born not of pity, but of two wounded souls finding refuge in one another. For the first time in months, she felt laughter come freely, and for the first time in years, he felt the emptiness of his ranch easing. Together, step by step, they were beginning to heal. The morning broke clear and golden, the prairie grass swaying gently, as if the wind itself carried secrets. The widow had been helping in the barn, brushing down one of the mares, when the cowboy called her outside. His voice was steady, but there was a note in it, something weightier than usual. She stepped into the sunlight, wiping her hands against her skirt. He stood by the corral fence, a leather folder tucked beneath one arm. For a moment, he only watched her, his eyes searching her face, as though measuring whether she was ready for what he held. "Got something for you," he said at last, holding out the folder. Puzzled, she opened it. Her eyes fell on the papers within, the words inked clear and final. A deed, her name written beside his. Land, acres of it, enough to build again, enough to call her own. She shook her head in disbelief, her hands trembling around the parchment. "I can't take this. It isn't mine. It is now," he replied, his voice firm yet gentle. No one will ever take from you again, not a banker, not a neighbor, not the world itself. This ground is yours, as much as mine. Her throat tightened, tears welling until the words blurred. No one had ever fought for her, not like this. She clutched the papers to her chest, as sobs broke free, not of sorrow this time, but of something she had not felt in so long, hope. Why? She managed, her voice raw. Why would you do this for me? The cowboy stepped closer, his hat shadowing his face, though his eyes burned steady into hers. Because I know what it is to lose everything, because I won't stand by and watch you be broken by it. But more than that, he paused, drawing a long breath. It's not charity, and it's not pity. It's because I want you here, with me, not just as someone I helped, but as my partner, my wife. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and yet tender, as if the whole prairie had fallen silent to hear them. Her heart pounded, disbelief, battling the warmth that flooded her chest. She had dreamed once of love, of safety, but that dream had been buried with her husband. Now, standing before this man, she felt it stirring back to life. She dropped the deed, letting it flutter in the grass, as she covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but this time they carried light. You mean that, truly? He nodded once, simple and sure. Her answer came not in words at first, but in the way she stepped into his arms, clutching him as though anchoring herself to the earth again. When at last she found her voice, it was a whisper against his chest. Yes, I'll be your wife. The promise was sealed there, under the endless sky, where land and love both became hers forever. The wedding was not grand, nor filled with lace and finery, but it was true. A preacher from the next county rode in, standing tall with his Bible beneath the open prairie sky. A few ranch hands gathered, their faces sun-worn and kind, while neighbors lingered at the edges, curiosity tugging them closer. There were no bells, no polished pews, only the whisper of wind through the grass, the low snort of horses tied nearby, and the vast heavens above them bearing witness. The widow, no longer broken, no longer bowed, stood in a simple dress, mended at the seams, her braid falling loose over one shoulder. The cowboy beside her was rugged and steady, his dark vest dusted from work, his hat shading eyes that had softened only for her. When they spoke their vows, their words were plain but carried the weight of something deeper than gold. In town, whispers circled, some muttered at the swiftness of it, others scoffed at her fortune, but none could deny the strength in the way he held her hand, nor the pride in the way she stood tall beside him. For once she was not pitied, not mocked, she was seen. Even the banker appeared at a distance, stiff in his fine suit, his lips drawn in a bitter line. He had stripped her of everything, yet here she was, radiant, standing on land he could no longer touch, carrying a name he could never steal. His power over her was gone, and his silence was the only surrender he could give. As the sun sank, painting the sky in fire and gold, the newlyweds mounted their horses. Side by side, they rode up the ridge, his loyal dog trotting close behind. At the crest, they paused, gazing over acres of rolling hills that stretched endlessly before them, their land, their home, their future. The wind caught her veil of loose hair, and he reached over, taking her hand in his firm and certain. For the first time since the river of sorrow had swept her life away, she felt truly anchored. He had given her land, he had given her his name. But more than that, beneath the endless prairie sky, he had given her forever.